So this is my first published fiction piece. I started writing this a couple of years ago, and it's only in halfway decent shape thanks to Seth and everyone else in the workshop. So thank you all. This story centers on a kid named Josie, who's a seventh grader right now. So she's about 12, 13. And the story is about the impact on her family when her brother, who is in the military, comes home, and sort of the adjustments that everybody's making. So this starts in the middle of the story on a day when Josie, well, I'm reading from the middle, so I'm on page 247, and it starts on a day when Josie comes home from school, being dropped off with her friends. So 20 minutes later, Josie and Amanda were singing the latest Taylor Swift song at the top of their lungs as Amanda's brother made the left-hand turn off the main highway onto the long dirt road that led to Josie's house. They sang not because they were big Taylor Swift fans, but because it drove Andrew nuts. He let them get away with it in exchange for Amanda not telling their mother about all the times he drove to places he shouldn't, usually with girls he had been told to avoid. Josie's family lived 10 miles out of town in the farmhouse that had been in her family for generations. They still owned the nearly 500 acres that surrounded the house, but all but the 15 acres closest to the house were now leased to others to farm on their behalf. As they made their way down the quarter-mile drive, Josie saw several migrant workers in the distance, appearing and disappearing between the large tree trunks that lined the drive, like actors in a poorly drawn film animation book. Josie pushed the button to lower her window and let the breeze and the outside smells into the car. She always liked this time of year best. The days were getting warmer and sunnier, everything was starting to bloom, and the smell of fresh earth hung in the air as all the dirt got turned for spring planting. Although she hadn't told anyone, she planned to take over the farm when she got older. She liked having acres and acres of open land all her own. She loved growing things and was already good at it. Plus, she liked the idea of being in charge, just like her grandmother had been up until she died a few years ago. As they neared the house, Andrew spun the wheel and hit the brakes, sending the car into a sliding halt in the gravel apron in front of the front porch, stopping just inches away from Dan's truck. Josie reached forward and punched Andrew on the shoulder. Ow, what the hell did you do that for? Andrew asked, rubbing his shoulder like it actually hurt. For nearly hitting my brother's truck, you dumb shit. If he saw you do that, he'd probably come out here and kick your ass. Plus, if my parents saw you do that, they'd never let me ride with you again. Their eyes locked in the rearview mirror, and Josie felt a funny warm wave ripple through her stomach. It was rather pleasant. I guess I better not do that again, because you'd miss me too much, Andrew replied, smiling and keeping his eyes locked with hers. Yeah, you wish, she retorted, but couldn't help but smile back. Tell Dan I said hi and happy birthday, Amanda cut in, breaking the moment. Josie grabbed her backpack, slid out of the car, and slammed the door. Text me and let me know how it goes, Amanda called out, rolling down her window. I will, Josie replied over her shoulder, not bothering to turn around as she headed toward the house. She could hear Andrew complete the U-turn in another swirl of gravel as he and Amanda headed back down the drive. In a few short seconds, the noise of the speeding car gave way to the quiet bustle of late afternoon in the country. Josie stood before the steps of the front porch, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath, letting it all sink in. The song of a meadowlark fluttering in the distance, the buzz of a bee nosing around the flowers that were starting to bud in the front flower bed, the sound of a pickaxe out in the fields. Some vibration coming from in the house. Josie opened her eyes looking around, noticing that only Downey's truck was in the drive. Both of her parents' cars were gone, so they still weren't home from work yet. Josie followed the vibrating thump up the front stairs, across the porch, and to the front door. As she opened the door, the assault of loud, harsh rock music made her blood run cold and her heart start to pound. Lately, when Danny cranked his music up like that, it was a sign he wasn't doing well. Josie dropped her backpack and jacket on the floor by the door and bounded up the stairs to the second floor, hoping she might be able to talk to Dan and get him in a better mood before their parents got home. She turned right at the top of the stairs, making her way across the landing that overlooked the two-story entry. Danny's room was the first door on the left as she entered the hall. She found herself tiptoeing across the floor, even though with the blasting music, there was no way he could hear her coming. As she approached Danny's door, she lifted her hand to knock and noticed that the door was cracked open. Thinking that he wouldn't hear her knock anyway, Josie pushed the door slightly wider and stopped short on a sharp intake of breath. It had been a few days since she'd been in his room, but the normally neat space had stuff strewn all over it. Clothes mostly, but other things that looked like they had been smashed covered the floor. His prosthetic leg and foot lay on top of a clothes heap that resembled a pile of smelly garbage. The drawers in the dresser were half open, with more clothes hanging over the side, as though he'd been frantically looking for something he couldn't find. Dan sat on his bed with his back to her, looking out the large window above his bed on the wall, opposite the door where Josie stood. This was the first time Josie had seen him without his shirt on, in the 4 months since he'd returned. She felt tears sting her eyes as she looked at him. Raised welts and tracks spread all over his shoulders and torso, and a web of scars that looked like the tentacles of some creature trying to take over his body. She took a step back, making sure he couldn't see her, thankful that he hadn't seen her initial reaction to his back. From her vantage point, Josie could see his face reflected in the full-length mirror propped against the wall by the right side of his bed. There was a star in the middle of the mirror that sent 2 cracks running in opposite directions. It had clearly been hit with something, although Josie had no idea what. Danny sat still as angry music with the yelling singer swirled around him. He seemed to be tapping something against the stump of what was left of his right leg, but from this distance she couldn't tell what it was. His face looked serious and angry, but his eyes looked a million miles away. Josie wasn't sure he'd see her if she walked right in front of him and danced. At any rate, it didn't look like the talk she had planned would work, and the last thing she wanted was to accidentally make him mad. She had just decided to leave him alone when he raised the thing he'd been tapping on his leg and put it to his temple. Now Josie could see the gun clearly reflected in the mirror. Danny pulled the trigger. Josie's hands flew to her mouth, smothering the scream that nearly escaped. Tears streamed down Josie's face as she nearly collapsed in relief over the fact that the gun hadn't gone off. For a moment she froze, paralyzed in shock. Then she found herself running down the hall to her room, fueled by adrenaline and fear. She shut the door louder than she meant to and locked it.